The focus of this paper is to look at three sites of resistance within South Africa. The first is the Inkaning shack settlement in Marikana, and the other two are shack settlements that have emerged in 2013 and 14. One in Cato Crest in Durban, which is the Marikana land occupation, and the other one is the new Marikana settlement in the Western Cape. And really the point of the paper is to ask, how do we understand Marikana as a political event in the South African political landscape? And what does it mean for these two places to be called Marikana? And I argue in the paper that we can see a subaltern sphere of politics, if you like, emerging in South Africa. And then I ask, if there is a subaltern sphere of politics, what are some of its features? And I mean, these three places are very different places with very different politics, different modes of political organization and ways of organizing themselves. But there's also quite a few similarities between them, particularly in the way in which they are perceived and represented in the liberal media space, which is often as criminal, violent mobs. Often people in Inkaning and the Western Cape and Durban are frequently told to go back to the Eastern Cape, that they don't belong there, and that they can't get housing there, and that they can't get access to land. And so, I mean, any attempts in South Africa for people to present themselves or to protest or organize outside of dominant liberal institutions like parties or trade unions, like what we saw at Marikana, is often met with an incredible amount of violence. But I also argue that, in fact, if we examine the content of what I'm calling a subaltern sphere of politics, you often find that, particularly in Inkaning, in Marikana, during the strikes, for instance, that when the men on the mountain organized autonomously outside of trade union bargaining structures, that we see other political modes of organization emerging, particularly historically older modes that are informed by people's rural experiences, because many people still have homes in the Eastern Cape, and I mean, it's very much still a migrant labor system. And so, I mean, some of the features of this and when people organize outside formal structures is that often, you know, these organizations have horizontal practice. They focus on democratic consensus, on communing, even songs they sing, or some features of the you know, like we saw the Men of the Mountain reference, I suppose, older struggles. In Marikana, this could be in the Mpando Waltz, for example, but there could be multiple examples of historical struggles. And so I think when people start to organize themselves, it threatens liberal institutions, you know, and the language around people's organizations is often to depoliticize them and to criminalize them. Often people's protests are called service delivery strikes, which is extremely depolitical a category, and it often takes away from much of people's political demands. And often, I mean, what I found emerging in all these three sites of resistance is often that these demands are for land, that urban shack dwellers, the politics is rooted in the politics of land and dignity, and this has failed to be represented in the media. And I mean, often what happens is that the state responds to people with an incredible amount of violence. I mean, as we know, the Marikana massacre, but even in the Western Cape and in Durban, for instance, you know, people have been brutally assaulted. In Durban, people are frequently murdered through the state. And so when this happens, you know, people are often thrust onto the legal domain. They often have to make strategic alliances with perhaps some actors in the bourgeois elite sphere, I suppose the elite political sphere, who in some senses have gotten to understand what popular struggles are about, which is often, I mean, like with the EFF in Marikana or Ses'khona in the Western Cape, for example, you know, they've started to understand that some of the politics around shack settlements is about land, and, you know, they've started mobilizing around there. But often what happens is people make these strategic alliances because they need help, because they need to stop the violence. So, you know, when people in the Western Cape say when Sasquana arrived, the eviction stopped, the violence stopped. Or like strategic voting for the DA with Abashlali Basimjondolo in Cato Crest in Durban was just to stop evictions. It wasn't any further, political commitment than that. And so I think also when we understand people's popular movements, we must know that even when strategic alliances are made in this way, that there's often still an autonomous politics that remains, and that depends on how strong internal organization is and how strong, I suppose, horizontal ties and practices are. I have noticed that, for instance, in Cato Crest in Durban, because people have had a longer history of autonomous organization, they're often stronger internally and they can make alliances with people on a much more equitable basis. But we must also remember that even when these strategic alliances are made and people are legally represented, or they are forced into the legal domain, where in fact they're often excluded from civil society, that there always remains these horizontal ties and this horizontal praxis, and that these two things often exist side by side. And only one is really legitimated in civil society, and the other one is completely criminalized. And it's for this reason that I've argued that we can in fact see or understand this as subaltern politics. My previous work focused on research with the women's movement, Sikhala Sonke, in Nkaneng, which started during the strikes and was really an organization that started to assist the men on the mountain, because obviously all the men were on the mountain and the women had to organize things in the community, things like food. They organized marches and protests against police brutality, and they often, like in Cato Crest in Durban or in Western Cape, had to do the emotional work, I suppose, of when people are traumatized, like we saw in Marikana, or physically wounded and injured. And I mean, that to me was really interesting, because you had these two autonomous organizations, one the women's movement and the other the men on the mountain, that challenged, I think, so much of dominant literature on mining communities, which is often seen as, through a very narrow class analysis that only focuses on workers and wages. It doesn't really see the multiple connections that happen through community organization, through women's movement, through demands for things like land and schools and creches and roads, and that these things all mesh into each other, and we can't just focus on wages through what is sometimes a very narrow Marxist analysis. And I mean, when I went there and saw that, and I saw that emerging, this different kind of politics, it really interested me. And when I went back to Marikana, in fact, obviously those autonomous organizations no longer existed that autonomously. The men on the mountain obviously mostly have now joined AMCU, the union that's representing them, and Sikhala Sonke have made very strong alliances with the EFF. And I suppose that made me kind of think about, well, what does that mean? What does it mean? Because often people are excluded when they represent themselves, and then they have to form these alliances. And what does that mean for autonomy and how people protect their politics? Because often once you join a formal institution, the politics of a particular or specific space is often part of broader issues. And I mean, usually when people organize amongst themselves, they do this, like I said, along horizontal ties. In Marikana, it's kinship ties, it's people from home, it's relatives, it's people who live with you in the community. And that for me produces a very different politics than if you are linked to a broader liberal institution. So I mean, that really made me think about the politics of community organization and the shack settlement, really, because the demands for land and dignity and things like that. And so when I went back there, I also then heard about the other two Marikanas, and I thought that it would be really interesting to find out why those places are named Marikana. And in fact, only Marikana in the Western Cape, people named the settlement after Marikana because they say that it means violence, right? It means that whenever a community clashes with police, that's Marikana. But in Cato Crest in Durban, what's really interesting is that people didn't give the land occupation the name Marikana. In fact, it was given to them by the councillor and by the police in the area. And they gave them that name because they said that they were asking for things, and because they were asking for something, and because they were troublemakers. So, I mean, what really emerges is that Marikana is this, it is this trope that everybody acknowledges, is very violent, and it epitomizes violence. So, I mean, that for me was very interesting.